Everybody, and welcome to our webinar today, where we will be going through some of the findings and the results from our industry salary report for 2024. Joining me today, we have our industry partners from Citrus Group and COPC. We know how important having this type of data is for our members and for the whole industry, and we're excited to start sharing it today. And obviously the report will be available soon, so we'll give you more information about that. In the spirit of reconciliation, Auscontact acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes, and during that time, we are sure you'll be quite interested in some of the trends and results that really are evident across the last few years of this report. We really get to see that through the consistency of the questioning and the work that COPC have done for us through this report. It's a great opportunity to hear from Alex Boland as he shares those insights into the data and what it's telling us. And it's a great opportunity for you to ask those questions as well. So I'm Fran Southward, CEO of Auscontact, and I'll be your moderator for today. I'm just going to run through some general housekeeping with you. Like always, we encourage participation. It's the way you can ask those burning questions and really maximise the benefits or the insights that you then take away. There's no need to take too many notes. We will provide you with the recording of the webinar afterwards. And as I said, the report will be released in the next couple of weeks. As we're working through the program today, make sure you use the Q&A button or the chat feature on Zoom. If the questions are relevant to the points that Alex is actually expanding on or some of the data maybe that Julie's talking about, I'll actually stop the session and we'll ask them in real time. But if the questions are more of a general nature, we'll keep that for the end of the session where we have an opportunity to go through those. If you're anything like me though, if I don't write that question down, I'll forget it by the end of it. So make sure you just put it in the chat, and that way where it makes sense, I'll make sure to throw it in for any one of the panel to answer. If you're listening through headphones or speakers and have any issues at all as you're going through it, use the raise hand feature on the control panel, and one of the team will jump in and try and help you. Alternatively, you will have all had the numbers provided to you in the original registration email, so you can just jump on that way. Obviously today though, it's probably more important you can see the screen, so hopefully no tech issues from your end. I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to introduce our wonderful industry partners. So firstly, we've got Julie Curry, who is the Director of Client Engagement at Citrus Group. I think, Jules, this is the fourth year where we've done the salary survey with Citrus Group. And again, such important information, particularly to be able to see year on year. So thanks, Julie, and thanks to all of Citrus Group. And then we have Alex Boland, who is the Director, ANZ Operations at COPC. Alex is one of the key contacts that we work with at COPC, our industry research partners. They do a lot of work with us, and we know how valuable that is to everybody right across our membership in the industry, and helping not only to benchmark, but to really ensure that there's some real validity around the data that's actually being then utilised to benchmark. So Alex, I'm going to hand over to you. We'll get this started, and yeah, Julie, we'll jump in with insights as we go. But yeah, over to you, Alex. You're on mute. Still on mute.
I'm definitely still on mute. There I go.
There we go.
It did that then when you share your screen, all the Zoom options disappear. Can you see now my screen and hear me? Do I have both of those?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, great. And thank you to the attendees. I can see there's loads of people who've already joined. Fran, as you were doing your introduction, I quickly scrolled through the list, and there's a number of people who contributed to this report who've now joined in on the webinar. So we had like a tremendous response to it. We had 175. It was actually more than 175, a number of duplications from the same organization. So once we strip that back, 175 contact centers are represented here. And as I say, a number of those people are on the call now. So I particularly hope that you get the value of this, as well as what I'm taking you through is like some of the insights, some of the high level things that I think is particularly interesting, but there is the full report after this. So we can send that out to you when it's finally ready for release, which shouldn't be very long from now. And I will take you through some of the roles. So I will take you through some frontline staff, some team leaders, some supporting roles, and where the bands sit for salaries now. But just know there's 30 roles, 40 roles covered in the report. The report is quite extensive. This is just a high level. So 175 centres were involved. The big industries there, so insurance, government, outsourcing, logistics, transport, but really many industries are represented across it. It's quite diverse. When we break it down by location, unsurprisingly, Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane account for the majority of centres. But we have regional centres, and we have centres basically from every capital city and from every region across Australia. So it's really quite representative. The breakdown on the right-hand side is just giving you a breakdown of regional versus metro. So with metros kind of being around 80%. But then in terms of number of centres, so 60% of respondents were representing a single contact centre or single site. But then there's a number that had 2 sites or 3 sites and whatnot. In terms of the last kind of profile piece rather, in terms of how many frontline staff in each centre, this is a breakdown here, as in they had 29% less than 25 people. Then there's a big chunk from that kind of 26 up to 100. Then we have above 100, with about 25% of them being above 100 and 7% over 500. The focus of this report and this research, and we've done this for a number of years now, so we're able to trend the data, which is really interesting, is to be able to see those kind of longer term trends. So before I share data directly from the report, I wanted to start by looking at the data from ABS, so like Australian data, not specific to contact centre now, just what has annual salaries done, what has salaries done over time. Because most of my clients are feeling a cost of living pressure in terms of the way that we do business, a cost to increase salaries, a pressure to increase to attract staff members and to retain staff members. And I wanted to put that in perspective by sharing with you performance data from like 20 years of what salary actually look like. We're right now at almost the highest level we've been at in terms of the percentage of salaries increasing, like how much they're increasing by, is the highest it's been for the last 15 years. But the level we're at now is actually not very different from where we were in like 2005, 2006, 2007, like leading up to the global financial crash. You can see that we've had a big increase from 2020 when it was very, very low to now just jumping year on year. And what's interesting is that very last data point seems like the trend is breaking. If you're a data person, you'll know that like a single data point really doesn't tell you anything. We can't be confident of that. But the question in my mind is the wage growth that we have seen over the last few years likely to continue, or are we going to start to plateau at the same levels we had in the 05, 06, 07 era? But we're currently at the highest we've been in about 15 years when it comes to wage growth. So a really tricky time for operations. So Julie and Fran, taking this perspective and from your roles, I wonder if you had any comments or thoughts about this chart in particular.
I jump in there. I'm finding when I'm speaking to clients that this is definitely the trend I'm seeing. I think throughout the sort of COVID periods, there were big increases in particularly in the perm salary space. And what I'm finding now is everyone's feeling the pinch. So new budgets are out. Those budgets are not necessarily increasing, and people are kind of having to do more with less. And therefore, salaries, I feel, are starting to plateau a little bit.
Yeah, we're probably seeing the same talking to different members, particularly in their planning cycle for the next 12 months. The money has to stretch that much further. So it's not that their budgets are increasing, but the costs just to do the BAU year on year, your on costs are just going up. So it means more than ever it's important to couple this information with how else do we look at what it is that we do. But it's interesting to see that sort of, I think for the first time in a long time, that slight dip at the tail there, Alex. But again, if there's still an expectation that it's going to be somewhere between a 3 and a 4%, year on,
Mm.
even at a settled position, it might not grow anymore, but where does it drop back to over the next 12 months? Because in fact, that's what people need to be planning for.
Yeah.
I think there are some expectation shifting, though, with employees, Julie, and you're probably seeing some of that in the market with, as you say, and I think it was you that had sort of said to me once that, a whole lot of people during COVID suddenly got offered a lot of money to do some different roles. Now they're looking around and it's like, oh, I can't quite get that elsewhere. I'm going to kind of stay. So there might be some other behavioural shifts that some of this drives as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about those trends. 4% year on year is like very quickly adds up to 10% to 15%. So
Correct.
How sustainable is that? So thinking about like how we're hiring, and then I'll just talk about the actual salary increases that we see. So how long are the formal probations for frontline staff? And this is interesting in the sense of it's not just cost of salaries being higher than they've been before, but the cost of getting it wrong, not hiring the right people, and then having to replace them is quite difficult as well. But 69% of centres have a 6-month probation period, and then 24% are around that 3-month period. So they're locked in. On the right-hand side, though, we asked around what the triggers are for them for increase in salary. So annual performance reviews are the single biggest reason why they increase. But 46% saying that it's a change to the award, and then 33% change to EBA. But that's kind of what's happening in terms of probation finishing and when we trigger. What level is that trigger at, I think, is a really important question. So on the left-hand side, we asked, did you increase permanent frontline staff salaries? So 86% said, yes, they have increased. So in the last 12 months, they have increased. And that figure is quite consistent year on year. It's around 86% say they did increase to salaries. So by far, that's the default. The change is in the right-hand side when we're talking about how much. So if you did, how much did you actually increase that by? And essentially what we're seeing year on year, so 2022, 23, 24, is that there's a shift to the right-hand side. So while the proportion of organisations increasing salaries hasn't changed, the amount they're increasing by has changed. So the detail is there in the chart, but there's a summarised section down there below, which shows you proportions saying they've increased by 4% or more. In 2022, it was only 11% of centres who said they had that 4% jump. Last year, it was 46% of centres. This year, it's 63% of centres. So we're seeing proportionally larger increases in salary. And because of that, we adjusted the scale. So if I look at it just now for the updated scale for last year and this year, it goes up beyond 5% and 6%. So for instance, in 2024, actually 5% of centres said they increased by more than 10%, like really quite a big jump. It was a larger proportion last year, 9%. But if we just put it all together as a summary view of how many have increased it by 5% or more, actually 45% of centres, so almost half of the centres that have increased salaries by, have done a 5% jump in salaries, like at least 5%. You can see that there's numbers there, so 67 and like at least 5%, 45% of centres. Compared to last year, it's at 31%. So let me show you what that looks like for a standard frontline staff member. So for inbound customer service, frontline staff, in the dark blue, that is the new hire entry-level salary. And then we also said, what do you pay for your tenured or experienced staff members? The bands, again, we've had to change year on year because there's so much increases in salaries. But essentially, almost nobody is paying less than $50,000 for frontline staff. The midpoint for new hire is in that 60 to 65. But there are centres that actually are starting new hire frontline staff at above 75, above $80,000. Not by any means a majority. That was only 6% above 75. But if we drop that down to the proportion paying above $70,000, it's almost a quarter of centres are paying above $70,000 for frontline staff. And when I say frontline, I'm saying new hire entry level frontline staff in a customer service role. When we consider the tenured staff, so I'm shifting to the green now, that gets us up to almost 40% of centres are paying above, what number is that? Above $70,000. So some really big changes in salaries over time. And I suspect when we run this report next year, that the biggest category above 85, that might need to be above 95 whatever it is, like big changes here. If we look at it for team leaders, we've seen similar jumps. The midpoint is about $90,000 now for team leaders. It depends on a few factors, but $90,000 is the midpoint. So there's 1 or 2 centres who are still paying less than 65. And I should clarify, I can see some questions coming, so thank you for those. I haven't read them yet, but these are base salaries. They're excluding super, they're excluding incentives or other payments. We're just talking about base salaries here. If we look on the other side of the team leader scale, though, there's actually a reasonable group at paying above $100,000 for team leaders. So not quite 20%, but like 17% of centres paying above that. And the midpoint being in around $90,000. So I think it was like 52% are paying below $90,000, 48% above. So roughly the midpoint is $90,000 for a team leader salary, which my background in my family, many people are teachers. So I know that New South Wales teachers who are fully tenured are only about 120,000. Like there's not a tremendous gap between a fully tenured teacher and like the top 10% of team leaders are earning almost the same amount. So I find that quite interesting as I look at the data. One of the comments, though, when we look at team leader data is that people often ask us what drives it, what are the differences? Like if they manage more staff members, are they getting paid more or less? And we did ask that. So we could look at how many frontline staff each person is managing. You can see that the majority are in kind of the 6 to 10 or 11 to 15 frontline staff they manage. Some centres being much higher. So there was one centre that said they manage on average 25 frontline staff, one saying 5, like much smaller sort of numbers there. But when we try to split the salary by number of people, there was no difference in performance. Actually, it was flat. Like team leaders managing less staff members are not earning more or less. Same at the higher end. Julie and Fran, if I can bring you back in, these salary ranges, big changes over the last few years. Any reflections on either of those?
I think, can you hear me? Yep.
Yes.
The numbers are what the numbers are. I think, you picked on an interesting one there with that team leader role. And, I think some of that also goes to recognizing the impact that a team leader actually has within an organization. So I've got to say, I think contact center wages for a long time were actually pretty stagnant and needed to see some shift. But there's got to be a point where we're sort of saying, where does that stop? Where does that level of growth sort of settle? I think the comment around this slide, though, is a really interesting one, right? The difference in salary is not actually connected to the different requirements in role. Which, again, if you think about, kind of patterns and what's actually driving that result, it's obviously far more connected to, be it the external market or the expectation of employees or potential employees, as opposed to what's then expected to be delivered within that. And it'd be interesting to actually think a little bit beyond actually what they're being paid and then think about, well, what are we then expecting them to do within that band? And I will just call out, we compare it to teachers, and I would probably say a lot of team leaders have to act like teachers quite often. Kind of, if you think about those characteristics, they're kind of somewhat connected. But all jokes aside, the difference between managing 5 direct reports and 25 direct reports is extreme. I think that's probably, for me, the part that I go, interesting. It is absolutely disconnected to the expectations within it.
Yeah, and I could say, I think one of the things I'm very mindful of, the shift for team leaders and managers across the board, is that, I think their roles have changed quite significantly over the last couple of years. Very much was, working in a centre, managing people face to face. their skill set has had to change, as it has for many people, where they've had to learn to manage remotely, onboard people remotely sometimes. So I think the expectation on the team leaders has definitely changed, and therefore, a big shift in salaries was necessary and is necessary. I'd be interested to see the breakdown between, or if there is any changes between the people coming in from external, into promotion into those roles, and whether businesses are paying more for external hires as opposed to internal promotions.
Yeah, that's a really good question. The answer is that we don't have it in the data. We didn't ask that, but that I hadn't considered that. I think that's yeah, I'd be curious. It feels a little bit unfair, but I do know in some of my clients, externals get paid more than internal promotions. Yeah, that's interesting. If I flow it in, like moving away from team leaders from now into the other kind of core first level support roles that we think about, I have quality here on the left-hand side, and I'll bring up trainers on the right-hand side. And we use lots of different words for these roles. So we said training facilitator or instructor. They're not completely dissimilar from team leaders, but both of these are pegged a little bit lower in terms of the salary, with the QAs being lower than trainers as well. So for that QA space on the left-hand side, where I said team leaders are kind of in that 85 to 90 bracket, it's more likely that the QAs are kind of the 75, so 10 to 15% lower, 10 to 15,000, sorry, lower. Then on the right-hand side, it does depend. Trainers can be quite varied in what they actually do. So we do see at that high end, a bigger group of them above 100,000. So we have that 14% at that range. But then there's a whole cluster there from 70 to 85, so slightly lower than team leaders on average, higher than QAs. The other role, and I know some of the people here have a more of a WFM background, is I wanted to include WFM, and we broke it down by forecasters, schedulers, and real-time managers, just to see the breakdown here, and I've included it all on one slide. What's interesting to me is like the variation across that team, as in the right-hand side is trying to give you a high-level summary, left-hand side gives you more of the details. But a real-time manager, 22% of those roles are paying above 90,000. If you move into a scheduling role, then 39% are paying above 90,000, and then forecasters at 44% paying above 90,000. And that's interesting because of the quite big ranges that we see. So there's a lot still in the low, like 65, 70, 75. But actually, what number is that? 15%. 15% are paying the forecasters above 100,000. So above 110,000. So there's a really big range for workforce planners. I know we went through a stage in Australia over the last few years where WFM in particular was in really high demand for those sort of roles. So we see some pretty big salaries there. To give you a more high-level view, and keep in mind there's 40 to 50 roles, the full report has a lot more data here. I wanted to compare performance over time, performance salaries in that context over time. So the left-hand side is talking about frontline staff and those paying above $60,000. So if we look back for those entry-level roles on the top left-hand side, 2 years ago, it was only 29% were paying above 60,000. Last year it was 44. Now it's 64. So in 2 years, we went from 29% paying above 60,000 to now 64% paying above. It went from kind of the top 25% to now the majority of centres falling into that category. So some pretty big changes there. On the right-hand side, rather than using 60,000, I'm using the $90,000 bracket now. But what does that look like over time? So if we look at team leaders to begin with, team leaders 2 years ago, only 16%, so that's about 1 in 6 team leaders, were earning above $90,000. Now it's gone from 16% to 46%, earning above $90,000. So some pretty big changes. We also see schedulers had a massive change as well. They were only around 12% 2 years ago, now at 39%. We see though for real-time managers, so down the bottom, second from the bottom, for QAs, those roles are paying less generally, but the proportion earning over $90,000 hasn't changed. Same with knowledge managers. Trainers had a bit of a jump. And actually, interestingly, for talent acquisition and recruitment, and we do, different people respond year on year, but each year we've had at least 150 centres provide the data for this. On average, actually, recruiters are the same as where they were 2 years ago. Last year there was a jump and now it's gone back down. So for some of these roles, very little change in terms of proportion paying above 90,000. But for team leaders, forecasters, schedulers, quite a big jump. For frontline staff, a big jump in the salaries over this time period. So when we talk about like salaries, cost of operations changes over time, it's a little bit more nuanced than saying salaries are going up and they've gone up by a lot. In some roles, it's more than other roles. But one of the reasons why we kind of think about salaries beyond the cost of living aspect is the employee engagement. So we do a employee engagement survey. We ask around 12,000 staff globally how engaged they are with their job and a lot of different attributes. And what's interesting when we look at it for Australia is a number of these attributes we score fairly well on. So I'm likely to continue to work in my organisation. My team leader acts with integrity. I get regular feedback, coaching, like 70 to 80% saying they agree with those things. But when it comes to salary, it's pretty low. Only 46%. And look at the wording. It doesn't say I'm paid well. It doesn't say I'm paid, I don't know, highly or something. The wording that we ask them is, I'm paid fairly. Do I agree that I'm paid fairly for the work that I do? Less than half agree that they're paid fairly for their job at 46%. That's across like all the frontline staff that we survey. When we break that down by tenure, people who've been there for less than a year, 1 to 2 years, more than 2 years, the starting point's fairly low. Like not that many people actually agree they're paid fairly for their job, even when they only just got that job. But as their tenure increases over time, the proportion starts to decrease. They become less satisfied with their jobs. So Julie, maybe that ties into like internal promotions and how we do increases in salary, because as they become more tenured, they become less happy with the salary that they earn.
Interesting though, Alex, if you think about the slides you've already taken us through, we've seen unprecedented wage growth for these roles.
Yeah.
But actually it's had very little impact on perception of fair return. And again, it is just that, right? It's perception. But
Yes.
for me, I look at that in the starting point, that 56%, that's a really low starting point for people that are brand new in a role, accepting a role, right? They've said yes to it, right? They're still only 56% happy. It's like, you know, again, the fact that there has been that extensive growth, interesting not to see a correlated change in perception of fairness.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Julie, any thoughts from your side?
I think, and I might be jumping ahead here, Alex, so pull me back if need be, but I think when we start looking at salaries, I think one of the key things and one of the things that came up in our in-person session that we did yesterday was EVP is a big thing. And so while salary is really important, and it is, and we had some really good discussion around this yesterday, I think people are looking, if they're looking for like, sometimes the things that are going to keep people happy or happier. So based just on salary, this data is it's a little sad, isn't it? It's a little sad when you look at this information, but I think the EVP things are a really big one at the moment.
Yeah, because it is, to Fran's point as well, it's a perception. Like it's not a direct calculation in terms of satisfaction, it's a perception. And if you think that it's like a stepping stone, you see people being promoted internally and career opportunities, maybe you're willing to take the lower salary knowing that there's a future benefit to that, and you think it is fair for the opportunity that you get. I suppose that's the difficult thing in the outsourcing space, is that proportionally there's less internal promotion to other areas of the business than there are in the private sector, and we see a corresponding change in satisfaction. I also wanted to, like right now I've been talking predominantly around where are we now and what has happened in the past, but looking forward over the next 12 months, roughly the same proportion plan on increase in salaries. So I think it was 86% have increased over the last 12 months, 87 are planning to increase. So the ratio doesn't really change year on year with this. But looking at how much we're increasing it by, actually 80% of centres are planning to increase salaries by 3 to 6%, like 3 to 5.9% over the next 12 months. So there's a fairly big jump in salaries planned for the next year as well. And that's higher than last year when we asked people, it was only 65% planned to increase by that range. So we have had big wage growth. We've seen that year on year, but we should anticipate that when we run this report and talk about this in 12 months' time from now, we will expect to see still similar growth to what we've seen in previous years as well. So I'm not confident that we're necessarily plateauing in the contact center space. We'll probably see another jump in salaries. We also asked around lots of other aspects like individual bonuses, team bonuses, proportion, are they getting a larger or a smaller bonus? All of that's in the full report. But one thing we've included here is a little section on superannuation. We have firstly asked, do you pay the same to all roles in your centre? And we could almost drop this question now. It's very consistent. Almost all centres pay the same, but actually there's a reasonable proportion, like 10% of centres are paying above stat, so above the minimum requirements. It's changed from last year. I think that may be driven by with slightly less government responses than previous. And I call that out because when I break it down on the right-hand side here, by government versus non-government, in the government space, if you work in the government, 38% of contact centres from that space will pay above the minimum superannuation contributions, compared to in the non-government space. If you work for a bank or an insurance company that's offering you above that very much is the exception. Only 4% of centres fell into that category, which is interesting when we think that already superannuation's been increasing by like 0.5% year on year, and there's still 38% of government centres maintaining above that level. Beyond superannuation, we also asked about, I suppose this ties into your point, Julie, around the additional value adds that we're providing to employees. So it's now employee assistance programs, 95% of organisations are providing that to their centres. I think previous years, maybe that was 85%. So it's in that consistently has increased as well. But then there's other things as well, like the annual flu shot, fitness, whether that is the snacks or the fitness opportunities, restrooms. You can see the things that are like far less common will be like private healthcare or a free meal, but actually still 1 in 5 centres provide free meals to their staff members. So breakfast or lunch. We continue on that from more of a financial things. So previously it was about what it's like to be in the office. Novated leases, employee discounts, salary sacrificing, paid off time, volunteering, car parking. These are not the majority of centres, with the exception of the novated leases or employee discounts and whatnot. But there's still quite a big pool of organisations that are providing these to their staff members. When we go down to like employee share or equity schemes, so it's almost non-existent when it comes to the contact centre space. One of the other big changes I wanted to touch on before we flow into a Q&A, and I have about 3 or 4 slides to go, and then we'll get to those questions that have come through. So if you have a question that you haven't asked yet, now would be a good time to put it into the chat, and then the 3 of us will try to work through those. So we also asked around working at home, and the industry report that was recently published with Auscontact gave a slightly bigger view, but from 6 months ago roughly. This is an updated view focused on frontline staff, team leaders, and other contact centre staff. So 84% are now at home 1 to 4 days. Very few are actually at home 5 days a week. And about 14%, well not about, 14% are saying they're in the office all the time, full time. I find it's interesting to think about the story this paints though, when we look at year-on-year performance. So when we look at this from 2022, 23, 24, what we see is that there's a shift in the blue in the middle, like the proportion of centres doing a hybrid, a 1 to 4 days at home. As in now we've actually had less people working at home full-time, less people in that category, and a corresponding increase in the proportion of people going into the office full-time. But there's still a very big group, 84%, so like 5 out of 6 centres are doing the hybrid approach. I know in our previous research into this as well, when we ask organisations, essentially, are you stable with your plans or are you going to change it? The majority are saying they're very stable with it. So it might tweak, but working at home is by no means a fad that has come and gone or anything like that. It is the default. It is a default to be in a hybrid situation, not in the office full-time, not at home full-time, to have at least 1 to 4 days at home. The other point, and we wanted to include this as well, one of the conversations we had as we were looking at the data earlier this week is it's difficult to have the employee cost increasing at the same time as technology providers are promising you that if you buy their product, like all the calls will go away and AI will solve everything and invest in technology, not people, that kind of conversation. So we asked, like, what do you expect to happen to your frontline staff over the next 12 months? And about half are saying there'll be a change and half are saying there's not. But of those are saying there will be a change, 27% of the total are saying they'll increase, 20% are saying that they're going to decrease, as in the data wouldn't support that we are anticipating to reduce staff numbers, regardless of the reason, let alone technology. People's intention on average is that we'll be increasing staffing numbers, not decreasing staffing numbers. The AI experts telling you that everything will change and we will not have staff members if you buy their solution. It's not played out with the data set. And to wrap it up, I also wanted to touch on how we're hiring staff members. So now I know a number of my clients are finding it more difficult to attract the right people who stay in the job, that are satisfied with the wages and with the employee value proposition aspects. So 44% are using an external agency for at least some of their recruitment. We break it down here by new frontline staff and new leadership roles. What's interesting is just before I went into the historical data to see this, but proportionally, the centres that are hiring more staff members by third-party agencies have also increased. So it's not just that about half are using them, they're using them more rather than like the random job here and there. They're more likely to say that 40% or 60% of my staff members are now being hired from an external agency. That is the last slide I had to take us through. Fran, I saw some questions come through. Do you want to lead us on that discussion?
The first question that Kelly had put out there was, particularly around the EVP, and whether there had been a visible shift, a decrease in some of those other things. And maybe Julie, you can jump in with this. Are we seeing as the salaries increase, are we seeing a decrease in those others? Probably our initial view is some of that stuff is now just expected as opposed to being seen as a new or different opportunity. But have you got some view on that, given your connection in the market?
Yeah, look, I think I don't see a decrease in additional benefits. I think businesses are trying their hardest to become a little bit more creative with what they're offering their staff aside of salary. And I think that's a really important thing, that regardless of what salary you've got on offer, I think depending on who you want to attract into your centre, those additional benefits need to be reflective of what the type of people that you're trying to attract. So we had a good discussion around this yesterday around things like volunteering days and giving back and showing things like you're aware of the environment and things like that are really important to a particular demographic. And so when you look at that whole list of things that people are offering, to some people, having an Xbox in the office is really important. Some people it's not. But I think businesses that I'm speaking to at the moment are really mindful of when they do attract people, they want to keep them. And so they're looking at different and creative ways of offering different benefits that are not necessarily financially based. So, the meals are a thing that I'm hearing a lot of, and that came around particularly when we were trying to get people back into the office. So, we've gone from fully remote. We were trying to get people back into the office. What can we do to attract people? And free meals was a big one. And so I'm surprised that percentage isn't a little bit higher, to be honest, because of the clients I'm speaking to. That was a key thing. And we all know in contact centre people, we like our free food, we like our treats and those kind of things. So, I think the list of benefits will probably grow. If anything, even though we've seen an increase in salary.
You touched on a really interesting point there, though, around, a lot of this is about how we're attracting, but then actually keeping them there and the importance. And I know you talked a lot yesterday about the importance of that onboarding and making sure that EVP, again, where it's this mixed model, that people don't just want the money, they want more than that. They want the environment that supports and lets them thrive and all of those things. But actually it's got to match, right? It's got to, the EVP that's, publicised and built into your ad campaigns and the rest of it. If people turn up and none of that is felt, or in fact, probation's the only time they get the support and then it drops off, this continued onboarding and cycle of, kind of that first 12 months, the 18 months, there's such a missed opportunity, I guess.
Yeah,
Mm.
you're right. And back to, I think, Alex, you touched on it before as well, around, things like EAP, in my personal opinion, but that's not a benefit. That should be a given now. There's certain things that are a given, and we need to not shy away from that. That's not a benefit. That should just be part and parcel of business now.
Yep. There's a couple of really interesting questions here from Raz, and it's in relation to, Alex, some of the data. So,
Okay.
see or record any variations of salary levels based on performance that's remarkable. So again, agent and team level, leader level.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Not directly based on performance. Like obviously we see a difference, and you'll see in the full report, tenured staff members, what they earn compared to new hire. So if you assume that people have become tenured, they're performing reasonably well. We did ask around bonuses though, so individual bonuses, team bonuses, and you can see all of that in the full report. There's quite a lot of data. One piece around that is we were curious if centres were kind of changing how they pay people to cope with the cost. So i.e., are you adjusting the ratios of bonuses to base salaries? For the majority of centres, 75%, they haven't changed that. But of those who have changed, so the remaining group, the majority of those, 21% of all of them actually, said that now individual bonuses are a smaller component of total package. So of those who have kind of shifted the balance of what we pay and variable pay, they're more likely to have increased base salary, but not adjusted the variable pay component. So the variable pay on average has dropped across the centres.
And I think, the follow on from that, because it says here, are organisations more open or conscious about that pay for performance model? And I know one of the questions in relation to particularly the increases, some of that is built on performance reviews and things like that. But we also know that for many, particularly for government, it's an arbitrary review. So it's actually, you've almost got to be able to find a reason for the contra, as opposed to, I'll give you the pay increase. You've got to be able to demonstrate why you wouldn't, and when are we going to review this so they do get it? So there's some interesting behaviours that we see around structured performance reviews that are actually connected to pay increases that kind of play out. Next one, were there any industries that stood out in relation to some of those elements of pay for performance?
So less. I don't know about pay for performance. I didn't analyze it that way. We did analyze just base salaries by industries, and there was actually like quite a lot of difference. As a rule of thumb, if there was an outsourcer that responded, salaries are significantly lower than the private sector. But then when it went into government space, government on average was higher. Government, though, is less likely to do paid for performance than the private sector. So the totals potentially end up being the same, but in the private sector, it's not guaranteed. It's more likely that a component that's variable. In the government, it's like locked in higher base salary. And then as you saw in the super component, governments are far more likely to have larger super contributions. So more likely to have guaranteed money and probably a total being higher in the government space. In the private space, you might get that higher, but a component of that is with variable pay.
Maybe some of that connected to perception of security and things like that.
Yeah.
As far as question here in relation to significant differences? Sorry, regionally. So those in different parts of the country, city-based versus regional-based. I know we've seen a lot of organisations, really branch out, particularly through COVID with a remote view, but fully actually setting up bricks and mortar in regional sort of centres.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. And when we think about cost of operations, about 75% of your cost is going to be your people, maybe 85% depending on your centre. So when we think about cost, it won't just be the salaries, but also your ability to retain staff members. And in the question, like whoever wrote that, I saw that it said significant difference. Like not to be like overly nerd things out. When we talk about a significant difference, it means that we're 95% confident there's a difference. And when I ran the data, the model said the Oki can be 90% confident that in the city they earn more than in the country, but not 95% confident. So probably there is a difference. It's not a big difference, and it wouldn't meet that threshold of a 95% confidence that there's a difference. So it depends on the operation, but probably no, it could just be an anomaly in the data, or perhaps there is. It's not a very big difference regional. And actually, when I did it like Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, like no difference there. The only really key difference is when you break it down by industry and you look at government compared to private compared to outsourcing.
Yeah, interesting. There's a question here from Simon in relation to, I guess, when we talk about wage growth versus what we're seeing environmentally with cost of
I love
living.
this question.
Consideration of real salary growth compared to dollar value. So, i.e., factoring in changes to the cost of living and a potential link between sentiment and perception, I'm guessing here, to the sentiment of those under the tenure being paid fairly for the work that they do. I think, Simon, I would say absolutely. We all know that we're seeing and hearing the conversation around impact versus perception. And sometimes it's not about, is it fair for the job I do, but actually, is it a living wage? And can I do what I need to do with that, which flavours sentiment. But Alex, what have you seen with that?
Yeah. So I think the point of that question is kind of saying maybe people are not happy with the salaries because the increase is only just keeping up with inflation, and therefore you haven't moved forward.
You're not ahead.
I haven't recently looked at inflation numbers. I know that in the peak we were around 8% inflation and salaries weren't at 8% increases. I think we've dropped down from there. I think, Simon, what you're raising is a very valid point. I suspect we're, without having done the analysis but loosely across it, we're keeping pace or slightly in front, perhaps. So that'd be a good point to consider as we're going through the final report. I suspect we're not racing away from inflation and drastically keeping a gap. We're probably keeping up to it, or maybe slightly in front with the changes we've seen.
I think we haven't got any other questions up there at the minute, so keep them coming, guys, if you've got more. But certainly, that question from Simon, if you think about the figure, I think it was 56% don't consider it fair when they first start. So again, if we take those other considerations, and Julie, you see it, and you commented before on the fact that people are looking for more depending on the demographic and what they're looking for from work. And maybe we see an actual shift between the money being the driver when people have more responsibilities versus it's not always the driver. It can be the tipping point for someone who, I don't know, still lives at home, is well supported and kind of, guarded. They can afford to have some of those other considerations be higher for them. So they can afford to care more about what's your carbon footprint. They can afford to care more about, what is it that you're doing for community versus someone who doesn't have that same protection. I think sometimes some of that can actually skew what we think the data is telling us about a demographic.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right. If there's, if you've got two jobs, they're paying the exact same. For some people, depending on their circumstance, it's all about the dollar. For some people, like you said, that have got the privilege of maybe living at home with their folks or whatever it might be, those other things become a lot more important to them. So yeah, I think there's a real consideration there about who you're trying to attract or who you want to keep in the organisation.
Are you seeing many of your clients, Julie, really needing to rethink or reshape some of their expectations around salary when they first come to you? Like, are you finding you still need to do a fair bit of work with some organisations to really help them kind of meet the market almost?
Well, yeah, we are. And surprisingly, there was a lot of that, over the last couple of years, a lot of that. Not as much, I will say, a lot of that, obviously in line with the data trends that you see that obviously people have lifted. But, we are still working with a number of clients that are not in that, what I call that sweet spot in terms of, particularly for frontline agents, and trying to work with them on what we do there, because, you can't all of a sudden just increase your salaries, but, really looking at what they can do to try and make them more attractive, because fundamentally salaries are the salaries and your budgets are your budgets. So that's what I'm saying in terms of those people that are maybe paying a little bit under. it's talking now and working with our clients on what else we can do to make you more attractive and what you need to do internally. And it goes back to our point originally around the onboarding piece, what's on offer when somebody starts the organisation, is there a career path, all those kind of things to make the client more attractive for somebody to go and work at.
Yeah. Alex, any other insights that, kind of through the discussion and even through some of the questions that you think are worth sharing?
There's a lot we could talk about.
So many.
But I'm
And how many pages is the report? Like, we're talking a lot, and I know it was hard for you to kind of cut it down. But...
Yeah. Like 50 plus pages. There's lots and lots of data. Where appropriate, we've also trended that. There's other interesting things as well in the report, actually, a whole lot of things. I think from that point, though, I'm probably fairly comfortable here to leave it as it is. But I would say in the final report, like our contact details, the three of us will be in that final report. Yeah. I love this data. Like, I love looking at it. I love, like, one of our weaknesses as an industry is that we have too many people who shoot from the hip and make opinion-based decisions. We don't use data. Yeah. So if you get the report, you're wondering what that means, or you want me to split it down in another way, just give me a call or send me an email.
Tell us. Yeah.
Like, break that down. And like, our intention is to repeat this next year as well to keep the trend going. So thank you for participating. I encourage you to participate next year as well.
Yeah, I definitely echo those thoughts. I know, as a fellow number nerd, looking at it and seeing the patterns and the relationships between the data is actually what I love. And being able to then bring in the insights of where are the other potential opportunities? How do we support some of that growth through onboarding? What results are we seeing? We saw that split between who's using an external agency to recruit. Are we seeing better retention because actually how they're shaping that attraction and that overall recruitment strategy is actually geared more at longer term alignment? I think there's so much we can actually build into this. But I think, to echo your point, for anyone listening, once you do get the report, there is an opportunity for you to actually help us continue to shape and build on this. If there's stuff that you say, what I really need or what I want to hear more of is X, Y, and Z, reach out to Julie, Alex, or myself and give us that feedback, because again, it's for the industry. It's why we do it, and we can continue to build on that as we continue to actually do the report. So I think next year is next year 5, guys, of the salary report. So again, giving you that ability to look back and actually have the confidence in the process and the integrity of the data is incredibly important. So yeah, I will encourage everyone to reach out to you, Alex. Send you an email.
Yeah, I love those conversations.
and get you to break that data down for us. But yeah, and equally, Julie, if they've got questions about how they can improve some of that and think differently about attraction, I'm sure you're open to have those convos.
Absolutely, yeah.
Excellent. Okay, I'm mindful of time. Thank you, everybody, for coming along today. Thanks for the questions. They were great. The report has just a final couple of reviews to go through. We're hoping to get through that sort of next week and the week after. So we'll make sure we'll give you details once that's ready to release. As Alex said at the beginning, anyone that contributed to the report gets a copy sent automatically anyway. So watch this space. Another big year, and it'll be really interesting to see what the year ahead actually gives us in relation to growth, but equally, where's innovation coming into this, and what organisations are being really clever and strategic and innovative with what they see as ways to engage and sort of build that retention other than the salary on offer. So exciting times. Thanks everybody for coming along. We'll see you next time. Thanks, Julie. Thanks, Alex.
Cheers. Bye.